stands for the Forsyth Galleries at Texas A&M University Art Galleries. So I have like an extremely long title, but as part of my job, I get to help interpret our collections that we have and also teach hands-on classes like this. Normally we wouldn't be able to have so many in the class, which is awesome actually. This is one upside to the current state of the world. So this is going to be an all-level watercolors class, and every class is going to be themed. This week we're starting out nice and easy with loose florals, meaning that we're going to give the impression of a rose or the impression of a poppy, or we're going to totally make abstract made-up flowers as well. What you should have in front of you, you should have 2 jars of water, one for washing your brushes and one for picking up water to put into your pan. You should have your watercolor paints here or whatever you have on hand. If you got one of the Flourish kits, you're using the Prang 8 pan. And then these are semi-moist watercolors. Obviously that's because they are shiny and semi-moist. You also should have something to use as a palette. You can use this little pan here, or you can actually, if you're using the Prang set, just pop out the 8 pans of color and you can just use this as your palette. We're going to pre-mix colors before we actually start to paint. So this is going to be really helpful for that purpose. You're also going to be using today, for this particular class, we're going to be using round pointed tip brushes. And I have a couple of sizes here. This is the number 10. This is the from the Royal brush set, again, that was given away with the supply kits from Flourish. I've got a number 10 and a number 6 here. And these are really the best kinds of brushes for doing watercolor, because you'll be able to get really nice thin lines, and then also use the belly of your brush, or the thickest part, to hold on to a lot of moisture while you're painting to get really nice smooth strokes. You also might use a watercolor brush if you are so inclined, which just means that you have the water contained inside of the brush instead of in separate jars. That's handy, especially if you're using something like watercolor markers or watercolor pencils. These are awesome for that, and they sell them at Michael's all the time. One more handy dandy thing. This is something that I actually picked up at the Dollar Tree the other day. And this is just an organizer for your paintbrushes and pens. And you kind of can't see it at a great angle here, but it's kind of cool for letting your brushes dry, and also reminding yourself that they have a home and not leaving them sitting in the water, because I am terrible with that sometimes, and let them just soak in there. Please don't do that. Don't be like me. So we're going to get started, and part of doing a watercolor painting, one of the biggest parts of it is creating your palette to start with. You can select colors right out of the pan, or we can mix them up like I'm going to show you how to do here. And this is just an example of the type of arrangement we're going to end up with by the end of this class. And yes, we will accomplish that in just an hour. So I'm just going to take this off of my watercolor block. I am using the same pad that was recommended to you all through Flourish. And that is I'm going to open my blinds really quick because it's a little dark. It's a Canson watercolor pad. There we go. Shed some light on the situation. Okay, it's Canson watercolor pad. This is cold pressed paper, and it's about 140 pounds. And the pound just refers to the thickness of the paper, and the hot and cold press just refers to the texture that you have on the paper. Cold pressed paper tends to be a little bit smoother. Hot pressed paper tends to have a bit more texture, and that's just a matter of personal preference as you continue to paint and play around with watercolors. So I'm going to mix up my palette to start. So I'm just going to put my pad to the side, and I'm going to put everything in front of me so you guys can see. And the first flower that we're going to do is kind of an abstract flower. So I'm going to take this big number 10 brush. This is, again, a round pointed brush. And I'm just going to dip it in my water. And I'm just going to get a puddle of water going on my watercolor pan. So I'm making a puddle. dip, dip. And let's see, I'm going to start off with maybe an orange flower. So I'm going to saturate my brush and make myself a nice puddle of orange. So I'm dipping in the color, saturating it some more. And you can see that these semi-moist watercolors are much more viscous than or thick than the powdered pan watercolors that we used in the first round of watercolor classes. These are really, really great. They are awesome for creating really smooth color transitions. So I don't want to use orange right out of the pan. I kind of want to create kind of like a more saturated color. So I'm just going to rinse off my brush and then go and pick up some yellow and add that in there. And I'm going to go right into my red and add a little bit of that in there. Now this is a very warm color. If we wanted to make it a cooler color, what we would do is dip into our blue, just a smidge. I have paper towel, of course, for blotting on the side here. And I'm just going to touch my blue into that orange that I'm mixing up there. And you can see that that kind of dulls down the color just a bit. So there's the orange that we're going to start with. Now, of course, we're going to use a little bit of green because we're going to add accents of green leaves to our compositions here. Now, this bright, bright green is pretty, but I think for our purposes today, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to dip in a little bit of brown and kind of muddy up and deepen the green a bit. So we're going to go with kind of a florally muted forest kind of green. Again, we want to make sure we have lots of water on there. Going back in. I think next I'm going to maybe do a bit of a yellowy color. That's really bright and saturated. So I'm going to go and I'm going to add just a smidge, barely touching my brush into the orange. And again, since I'm doing a little bit of a muted palette, what helps with that is that good old brown, barely touching it, blotting it. Now we've got that going. Of course, we can't paint flowers, in my opinion, without pinks and purples and reds. So I'm going to make myself a nice big puddle of a vibrant red color. I'm going to take a wet brush and then I'm just going to barely touch my blue to kind of cool that down just a smidge. There we go. And there we have some drippage. I'm just going to go with it. We'll just add to it. There we go. So I've got a few colors to start, and this will be good for us to get going. I've got 4 colors to begin with. So I'm just going to kind of slide these to the side. I'm going to keep my pan of colors readily accessible because I may use colors straight out of the pan to deepen and layer the colors as we go. So I'm just making myself some room and cleaning up any messes that I make as we go. And I'm going to paint right on the watercolor pad. It's up to you. Some people like to rip out pages from their book or watercolor block and directly tape it to the surface that they're painting on. But that's a matter of personal preference. This is nice, thick, 140-pound paper. So we don't necessarily need to do that. It's not going to curl up on us too much. But again, it all depends on how quickly or slowly you work. So I'm just going to start with, again, with that number 10 brush, and I'm making sure that it's clean. So I've got it in my dirty water. And the brush is moist. It's pretty wet. So if I tipped it upside down, you can see there's actually like a bit of water that's about to drop off of it. We don't want it that wet. So I'm going to touch it to my paper towel. And then I'm going to go right into this orange color. I'm just touching it with the tip of my brush to get started. And I'm going to start by just touching the tip of my brush to the paper. And then as I move down in the brush stroke, I'm pushing down the belly of the brush to get a nice wide brush stroke. Filling that in as I go. I'm going to pick up a little bit more color. And again, starting at the top and pushing down, top, push down, connect it. We're painting wet into wet, meaning that we're working with these kind of diluted colors. And this will just give us the ability to really build color as we go. And this is a really simple shaped flower, just with 4 petals or so. And what you want to do while you've got it nice and wet is maybe start to add other colors into it. So I'm going to hit that little yellow that I mixed earlier, and I'm going to drop some of that into this really pale peachy orange. I might even add another petal, not even connected, to that. If you get puddles along the way, if you find that you're adding a little bit too much water, just tear off a piece of paper towel that you have handy, kind of wad it up between your fingers and just touch it to wherever you're getting those little puddles of color that you don't necessarily want. This is great for diluting and adding even a little bit of texture. I'm going to go and touch into my deeper reddish kind of color. And I'm just going to drop some of that by barely touching the tip of my brush to my paper. And I'm going to add another petal. Petals and leaves, luckily, are basically the same shape. So we're going to be using this brush stroke pretty often. We're alternating between using the tip of our brush and the belly of our brush to kind of get the wide strokes. So then I'm going to let that guy sit. I'm going to start right away on another one. I'm picking up more of that orange color, and I think I'm just going to add a bit more of the orange from the pan to saturate it a bit more. Blot it on my paper towel. And again, belly, tip of the brush to the belly, tip to the belly, tip to the belly, tip to the belly. You don't necessarily need to fill it in the entire way. A little bit more pigment. So I'm going into my orange again and going right back to this flower that we started with. And I'm just kind of going to keep adding a little bit more depth of color. And I'm barely touching the paper and just kind of letting the watercolor do the work for me. Maybe we'll add a little bit of pinky red to this guy. And then move down here, tip the belly again, tip the belly again. If you prefer to draw leaf shapes and then just kind of fill them in, that works too for this particular technique. And I think I'm going to go into my yellow and add some of that in there. There we go. Okay. Back in the yellow. Now in painting, typically in most art forms, groupings of odd numbered objects are more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Do I know why that is? Absolutely not. But it's just a rule of thumb that generally when you're doing a grouping of things, you want to do so in odd numbers. So I'm just going to zoom in just a little more so you can see. Again, adding that. I'm going to go in with some orange. Kind of just let that color bloom on your paper. Okay, that's enough of that one shape. So I'm going to wash my brush. We're not necessarily done with these. We'll go back to them. But we're just going to keep adding until we kind of have a bouquet on our paper. So the next flower that I want to show you is a loose interpretation of what would be kind of what I call like a basket flower. So I'm going to start with my green. I'm going to just dip the tip of my paintbrush into my green and then blot it quickly on my paper towel. And I'm going to make a umbrella shape here. And this is just with the tip of the brush. Kind of like that. And I'm going to do a couple of these around different sizes. And this is all intuitive painting, meaning we didn't draw things out to start with. We're not using pencil. We can add details with ballpoint pen after the fact if you like something to be a bit more illustrative in look. But for the moment, this is just to get you used to handling the supplies. Really play with how thick and thin you're making your lines. And that's all about pressure. I don't know about you, but sometimes my hand actually hurts worse doing really light movements like this because I'm kind of like holding onto the brush for dear life, but barely touching the paper. So we've got a few of these basket shapes in here. And I'm not going to add stems just yet. It's not necessary, but I'm going to clean my brush. And I'm going to go into this nice bright red that I mixed up earlier and just get some of that on the tip of my brush. And I'm kind of going to use a little stippling technique where I'm doing little dots of pigment to create kind of a spray. That is coming off of this basket shape that we created. And if you're using reds and pinks like me, sometimes I like to add just a little bit of purple. I'm actually just going to put some purple on my palette. And again, I'm just taking water, going directly into the pan with the purple. Mixing that to the side. So I've got a nice puddle of it. My brush was just a bit wet, and I'm just going to add bits of that color in there. You want to continuously blot in between touching your paper. Every time you pick up pigment, whether you think you have the right amount or not, it's always safe to blot, because you can always add layers of color. Taking them away, much more difficult. And again, if you have nice shaky hands like I do, just kind of letting your hands do the work for you is really helpful. So again, I picked up some purple and I am blotting some of that off. Going back in the red, let's add some there. And your colors are going to change and evolve as you move on. That's the handy part of mixing a palette of color to start, is that you kind of have a base going. So if you're adding from the pan as you go, you're going to get kind of a harmony of color doing it that way. rather than improvising. And this helps you because the paint kind of makes some of the decisions for you. And that's one of the frustrating parts, but also wonderful parts of watercolor, is that the medium itself is just so malleable. Just play around with depth of color. Let's let those dry and then go back to them. Half of painting is just looking at what you painted and knowing when to stop. So I picked up some of that deeper red. I'm going to go revisit our friends that we painted earlier. I'm just going to add a little bit of depth, just adding lines and more layers of color in there as we go. And again, since we have harmony on our palette, I'm not even having to rinse my brush in between adding these little details. Now these soft colors are great, but hopefully later when we do our succulents class in a few weeks, we will get to play around with more jewel tones. And in our leaf class as well, we're going to do tropical leaves and also some fall leaves because we're getting a sort of idea of what that could look like. Focus. Now I'm just going to bring this closer to my camera so hopefully it focuses a little bit better so you can see what's happening on my paper. My hand helps focus it. I always wondered why people in videos did that, but this is why. Okay, so we've got a few baskets, we've got some abstracts. I'm going to move on to my interpretation of a lavender sprig, and that is pretty simple. So I'm going to get my brush wet again, and I'm going to go into my purple and make a nice puddle of violet on my palette here. Rinse it off, and then I'm going to add some fresh water to it. Get my brush nice and saturated. The color is, you can tell that it's nice and saturated because you can see the color almost completely absorbed into the paintbrush, but I can still see the bristles in there. So you know that it's not so wet that it's dripping. So here we go. I'm going to just blot that quickly. And we're going to start with kind of a long stroke. So I'm going to pick a spot and just barely touching, do a skinny purple line, pick up just a little bit more pigment and pick another spot on our little arrangement here and do another skinny purple line. And then maybe this guy has a friend. I'm sorry if I turn into Bob Ross, it happens when you're teaching painting. And then maybe, no, I'm gonna leave it as is. So once we have our little baselines there, we're picking up more pigment. And again, we're gonna use a kind of a stippling technique. Really, I'm just kind of pushing the paint around the little puddles and then also using the paint that's already on my paper to add little dots and texture. Does scale matter? Absolutely not. Deepen that color just a little bit in some areas. Occasionally, I'm even using almost a dry brush. And watercolor painting is really like, well, any painting really, is kind of like finding out a new way of looking at your own handwriting. Like everybody has a different style. So if yours doesn't look exactly like mine, that is absolutely fine. In fact, that's encouraged. When I taught K-12 art, I hated when all of my students' projects looked exactly the same. This is an exercise in just kind of relaxing and letting the piece form organically. which it should because it's flowers, which are organic. Ignore my dumb jokes. How are we doing so far? Anybody having problems? I know Abby's monitoring the chat, but no? I'm going to take silence as success.
Everybody's really, really concentrating on their painting right now, I think.
Okay, good. That is not a bad thing. All right, so this one's even looser. Feel free to make dumb sound effects as you drop in color, as I often do. So again, I'm just deepening and layering the color. I think it might be pretty to add a little bit of our pinky red in there. So I'm going to pick some of that up. Blot, of course, and just add little hints of it around. And this is my interpretation of a lavender sprig. Not an actual lavender sprig. All right. So we've got more depth there. So I'm going to take this opportunity to just take a look at what I have going on and add some additional layers of color to our flowers that are already drying. So I think I need to mix up a little bit more red here. So I'll let you see what I'm doing on my palette. I'm making more of a jewel toned color as we move along. So we're moving light to dark. And again, I'm just going to drop that into the centers of our little abstract flowers. Because generally that will be the darkest spot in a flower just because of the way the light hits it. You'll get some tonal differences there. Letting that bleed out. If you're feeling sassy, you can kind of rotate your paper if you've got some drips happening. I'm going to stay with that red and add some more layers to our little basket sprigs here. And since we're working so quickly, it's kind of great because you'll be able to continue to work wet into wet. So we're just layering and adding, layering and adding. We'll tighten up the greenery later too. But a lot of this is painting very quickly. Watercolor does not give you the chance to think about it too much. Okay, so we've got a nice sprinkling of things going on so far. Let's move on to another type of flower. This time I'm actually going to do kind of like a poppy sort of color, sort of flower. So I've got the red that's already on my palette. I'm going to add even more of the red from my pan. And I'm also going to add some orange, a good amount of orange. And since some of our flowers are kind of translucent and light, these are going to be a bit more saturated. And kind of playing around between saturated color and translucent color is going to give you a lot of depth in your painting. So I've got this deep orangey red, kind of the color of poppies. And I've got that saturated on my brush and I've blotted a bit. And the great thing about poppies is they are essentially blobs. So I'm using the belly of my brush this time. And I'm making them small. And I'm going to do little clusters of them. Now, these kinds of flowers would never occur together in nature, obviously. We are making our own rules. Make some big, make some small. Maybe there's like a little cluster. You want to really want to drop some saturated color into the edges of these particular flowers. Excuse me, I'm getting like allergies. Okay. Now that we've got a few on our paper, I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush. And I'm going to add from my clean jar another couple of puddles into my pan. And I'm going to get yellow right out of the pan, really nice and bright. I'm going to blot it real quick. And then I'm going to drop some of that yellow into around the center of our poppies. These are the most simple flowers to do, and they're usually everybody's favorites also. So go figure. Sometimes the things that require the least amount of effort are the most successful. I'm gonna clean my brush. And now that I've got that yellow out there and I'm looking at the composition on my paper, I'm looking at things that I want to fill some of the spaces. So I'm just gonna take some yellow paint and I'm gonna go ahead and do little clusters of kind of yellow dots around. This is gonna be filler in between the stems that we'll add later. I really want that to be nice and bright and sunny. But again, whatever palette you're using is fine. If you're using something a little bit more subdued and pastel, that's great too. But I just want to add a bit more interest. Get your eye moving around your paper. I'm happy with that. A lot of it's instinctual. Cleaning my brush again. And I'm gonna go and take my skinny brush and I'm gonna continue to add yet additional layers of depth to those first flowers that we started. So I'm really into using this beautiful red. Blotting. I'm gonna go ahead and maybe add some line detail. Around the edges. Let's give these guys centers. Let's give them deep red centers. Why not? Really see we're building those jewel tones on here. Take just a wet brush and kind of refine some of that. Kind of push and pull and move it around your paper. Okay, now we'll let that dry for a beat. And now I'm going to show you how to do a very loose type of rose. And these are super, super simple. And since I've already crowded my paper quite a bit, mine are going to be kind of small. But these are really, really pretty, and you can use them and make them huge if you're wanting to do kind of a graphic like rose, bouquet of roses type painting. So let's start with, let's be wild and make blue roses. So I'm going to go next to my purple on my palette, make myself a puddle, and then go into my blue, really saturate it. Ooh, that is very blue. I'm gonna add, I think, just a touch of brown, just like barely, just to dull it a bit. So we get like a dustier kind of color. Okay, so it's kind of like a navy. Okay, so to start with your rose, again, our brush is nice and saturated. I've already blotted on my paper towel. And the middle of the rose, you're gonna start out making kind of a little spiral shape. So you've got that to start, just a little spiral. And you're gonna alternate again from the tip to the belly, moving around your spiral to create a loose rose. So I've got the basic shape and I've just rinsed my brush and it's wet, a little too wet. Paper towel to the rescue. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and make some of these a little bit wider, these petals. Make them sort of blur into one another. And then I'm going to dip my brush back in that pretty blue, almost like a denim blue that I just made, and kind of drop some more of that deep color in there. Extend my petals where I want to. I'm going to add definition to the insides of the petals, or the petals that are closest to the center. And I'm also going to let the negative space do some work for me. And that, again, when we're painting loosely like this, you want to let your painting breathe a bit. You don't necessarily need to cover your entire paper in stuff just because the space is there. The negative space is just as important as the space that you use. So I'm going to go ahead and load up my brush again with that pretty blue. And I'm going to add, start another spiral in the corner here, move my paper just a little bit up so you can see. So I'm going for the point to the belly, from the point to the belly, from the point to the belly. Maybe this guy is a little bit wider. From the point to the belly. Point to the belly. This guy needs a little bit more water. And this guy is going to be quite big. And I'm just going to continue to paint wet into wet and deepen portions of that rose. Just dipping and blotting. Using that push and pull method. Excuse my dog as he runs down the hallway. You can hear that in the background. Guys are lucky the mailman hasn't come. Get to meet him. Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of blotting there. Let those dry and breathe. A dry brush is also awesome for picking up puddles. So I'm taking this fluffy brush that I had just kind of like hanging out in my brush bin there, picking up a little bit of that pigment. Go ahead and add some more depth to my rose. Now you'll notice that we're layering, but we're going slowly. And we're using good amounts of water, but not so much water that we're having deep puddles all over the place. The reason for that is, even though we're using nice thick paper here, there's always the possibility of using too much water and overworking your painting. And if that happens, you'll start to get like pilling that happens on the surface of your painting, similar to what happens when you like wash a sweater incorrectly. And we're trying to avoid that here. So that is the whole point of going as slow as possible. I'm gonna do a couple of like little rose buds just because we're on the kick here, and I really am loving the way this blue came out. Rolling with the accidents. Big part of watercolor painting. Dropping more blue in there. Going back to my roses and adding more depth in the centers. Depth. It's amazing in just this short period of time. I don't know about you, but I've nearly filled up my entire paper with this little bouquet here. Sorry, my husband's banging around the house. You can even add additional petals where you see fit. Stick your hand in a puddle of paint like I just did. That's always a good idea. Right, move around. Okay. Some of that overlapped. Go ahead and wash my brush, and I think it's time to start adding some stems to things. So a little bit of greenery, but not a ton. I think rather than add a ton of stems, what we're going to do is just kind of fill in some of the negative space with leaf shapes. I don't know why I can't speak, but I've got a nice wet brush here, and I'm going into my green that I set out earlier. I'm actually going to add a little bit more green to that. And I've got this leftover yellow. I'm going to add some of that to it. And then I'm going to just calm this down a bit with some brown, since I've kind of got like a dusty thing going on here. So this is the fun part, I think. Well, I think it's all fun, but this is the extra fun part, is adding some greenery to your spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that same brush stroke we've been using all along, and I'm going to paint the outline of a leaf. I'm going to turn my paper around so you guys can see. So just like you did when you were a little kid, when you draw a leaf, you make that kind of shape, do a line down the middle, just using the tip of my brush, and do one of these guys. So you have that to start. So you want to alternate between maybe doing that type of leaf and then maybe one that we fill in completely. Have fun with the tips of the leaves. Get some interesting shapes doing it that way. Let's see, over there. So I'm adding another leaf up here. Again, just like you did when you were a little kid. And maybe this leaf has a little itty bitty friend. Maybe these little yellow guys have some leaves around them. So I'm just kind of indicating a leaf and then a stem. around these little itty bitties. Constantly moving my paper around. Let's see, let's add a leaf here. Another way you could do it is paint in 1/2 of it. It's totally cool if it goes off the page just a little bit. Filling this one in with just water. Did not add additional pigment. Go ahead and add some more depth to these guys. Let's see, maybe there's a stem here, maybe a couple of leaves. Moving around the paper again. I'm gonna rinse my brush. Let's do some really pale leaves up here. These are a little bit more mottled in texture. This is the instinctual part of it for sure. Just kind of finding ways to add bits of green. The stems don't necessarily need to make quote unquote sense when you're adding them in. We're just indicating where they would go. Because I don't know how this would occur naturally. Make some of them thick, some of them thin. Play around with the shape if you're not happy about the way they turn out initially. Okay. I'm going to add a layer of color to fill in one of these guys that we made earlier. This. Sop up some of that color. Fill that in that way. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker green again. So green right from my palette. I'm adding a little bit of brown to that to warm it up. And I've got a nice deep green now. As you can see, it looks almost black on camera, but it is indeed like a deep foresty kind of green. And I'm going to go ahead and add some details to those leaves that we just added. Just highlight certain areas. Lake Sioux. Really, I'm just deepening that color. And I haven't had to go in for more pigment in quite a bit, since this color is nice and deep and dark. But I'm continuing to move around my paper, to rotate it, not trying to be exact in any way, shape, or form. go. Add a little bit more in here. So if you end up being really proud of your piece when we're all done today, please feel free to share it on social and tag both Flourish and University Art Galleries, which is at TAMU Galleries. We love to see what you guys do during these classes. Usually everything comes out so beautifully. Okay. I'm gonna add a little bit more green because I see I've neglected some of my little guys down here. They're just little itty bitty guys. Drop it in. Adding some leaves. Using that little stippling effect that we used earlier too, to add just little bits of green in between. Is that a leaf? Is it a stem? We don't know. Doesn't matter. Still letting my painting have quite a bit of air in it, meaning I'm leaving room for the white to shine through. Okay, perfect timing because we are nearly done. One thing that we need to do to kind of wrap things up, to bring everything together, you can feel free to continue to add and layer and deepen all of the colors and really just kind of play around. That's the beauty of doing these sort of abstract floral compositions. They look very Pinteresty, and they're very, hip right now. People love painting in this way because it's approachable. And there's no wrong answer, which is my favorite kind of painting to do. So you can keep on layering, but make sure that you are taking a moment, take a beat, and look at your painting from afar, because we can get tunnel vision where you're just staring with this one piece in your face for such a long period of time, and then you tend to overwork pieces like that. So what we're going to do to end class today is to finish off our poppies, and they have that beautiful black center. So I'm just going to add a bit of water to a pan that I have available, and I'm going to go into the black. Normally we don't use very much black in watercolor, but poppies are an exception to the rule. It's important that you let them dry almost completely before you add this last step. So I've really built up some black pigment on my brush, and I have just touched it to my paper towel. And I'm just going to go straight into the center of one of these guys and make a drop and kind of manipulate it with the tip of my brush. Going back in the pigment, dropping in the center, manipulate with the tip of your brush, in the center, push and pull, play around with pressure. Maybe some of them are really clean and precise. Maybe some of them are messy. And I think with these abstract ones that we started with in the center, I kind of feel like they need a little bit of this darkness in the center of them as well. And this is a fully invented piece of Flora, so not accurate. We're not basing that on anything really. I think sometimes this mix of light and dark, different tones, some jewel tones, some pastels, some muted colors, just really adds interest to the overall piece. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry. Now I'm going to continue to add for the next 4 minutes, and now would be a great time to ask any questions that you have in the chat, and then Abby can read them out to me. If not, if you just want to continue to paint for the next 4 minutes, I'll just keep an eye on the time and keep moving. But I hope that you learned something this afternoon and continue to use these techniques in your watercolor practice. And really create kind of impressive works of art. I mean, this was less than an hour. We created, well, this is like a 9x12 painting, which we could pop in a frame and looks like we bought it somewhere, really. And it didn't require too much effort. We just kind of relaxed and played with the pigments and played with pressure and saturation and all of that fun stuff. I think I saw a question pop up. What was that?
Yeah, Anne is asking, will this video be posted anywhere? Yes, I am going to figure out how to